Welcome back. I'm here with knitwear designer Becca Smith of Bagsmith and author of Big Stitch Knitting. Hi, Becca.
Hi.
Welcome.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Oh, great. And how did you get started working with chunky yarns?
You know, I met a designer from the UK. Her name is Rachel John, and she makes rugs using 25 and 40 fibers all at the same time.
Oh my goodness.
And she designed these needles to use in making these rugs and other products that she makes. Some of the needles are as long as 32 inches long.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And so you can make things like rugs and Afghans all on these huge needles.
That's right. And I got inspired.
Sure. And so now you're not just using store-bought yarn that comes in a massive chunky bit. You're compiling yarns to make a super chunky yarn. How do you go about doing that?
Well, you want to find yarns that play well together, that are compatible. And for the pillow project that we're going to be doing here, I've got 8 fibers. 4 of them are a good heavy wool, and other 4 are novelty yarns. And I did a swatch in advance to make sure that all of these yarns were going to work well.
And by that you mean they don't stick together?
They don't stick together. They're not going to worm. You know, chenille, for instance, is not a good yarn to include in a project like this.
And then you also paid close attention to colors because you have the opportunity to play with the ratio of colors.
That's right.
When you combine so many yarns.
Colors and textures. And one of the things you want to do is make sure that they're going to easily move in and out. Normally we would have this on the floor.
Okay, so you put a couple of balls of yarn in each of several bins.
That's correct.
Okay.
And give them plenty of room. And interestingly, if you're going to work with cones, make sure the cones are standing up.
So they're not flopping around.
That's exactly right. And you make sure that they fit well together.
Okay.
So
where do we start for our pillow?
Well, we start with casting on.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And is it a special kind of cast on to work with so many yarns?
I like working with a long tail cast on.
Okay.
And you have to figure about 2.5 inches of yarn for every stitch.
Wow, because we're using such massive needles.
That's right.
Okay.
And you've got to also remember that when you're using this amount of yarn together, that you've got a stitch gauge of a stitch per inch.
Wow. And so how many stitches are we casting on for the pillow?
14.
That's it?
That's it.
And it's a very quick project then?
Very quick project.
Okay.
So I'm just going to cast on the way you normally would.
Okay.
And make sure that as you go that you cast on loosely because like any first row in any project, it's always the toughest to get off.
Okay.
And if you haven't worked with the big needles before, it gives you a chance to really make sure that you're going to be fine.
Okay.
And as you go, make sure the yarns are just laying flat.
Okay.
So.
Perfect. And then is there, the pillow is constructed, we're not making 2 sides to it. We're going to work the entire pillow in one rectangle.
That's correct.
And then fold it over itself.
You got it.
Not a triangle.
And
okay.
So what I did here is I worked it halfway up.
Oh, perfect. And it's just in stockinette stitch.
Stockinette stitch. So in order to get the ridge that we want to make sure that the next row is going to be a purl row.
And what does the ridge do?
The ridge is when you sew the whole thing together, this side of the pillow will be the same as this side.
So when you fold it in half, there will be, it'll look
ridges.
like the cast-on row.
That's right.
Okay.
The first stitch of any row you want to do will have a lot of extra yarn in it, and you want to take the excess yarn and just pull it up.
And that's a knit stitch, and you knit the first stitch of every row.
I'm doing that on this particular project. It gives you an even edge, and when you go to sew it together, there are little ways of just making sure that as you put the 2 sides together, you're going to be able to do it matched up, right? Then I'm going to switch to purl,
even though it's usually a knit row, and that's to make the ridge.
That's correct. Okay. And I get to show you a trick, because what you want to do is make sure on every stitch that you catch all the fibers. So you can stick your thumb through the stitch, and that way you're not going to have any loose fibers hanging around later on.
That's handy.
Yeah, it works really well. So let's pretend that we are moving on. We've finished our rectangle.
Okay.
And we're moving on to finishing the pillow.
So now, once you've completed your rectangle with your ridge, then what? What's the next step?
You take a single strand.
A single strand only.
And you start knitting it from the outside. You don't have to turn it inside out.
Okay.
You knit it from the outside just with a whip stitch.
Whip stitching it together.
All the way around 2 sides, leaving the 3rd side open.
Okay.
And here's my original cast on. Here's my bind off. They can be fringed later on. And you take a 12-inch pillow form, which you can get in lots of places. They're pretty available. And you slip it in.
Okay.
And then you're just going to continue on knitting, I'm sorry.
Whip stitching.
Whip stitching all the way along the other edge.
And you're done.
And you're
now
done.
it's just for the fringe.
Just for the fringe.
Okay. And you attach the fringe in the same way you normally would. That's a pretty small crochet hook you're using there.
Well,
Will it all fit?
it's easy to get through, and basically what you want to do is just pull all the fibers through like this.
Yep. And then pull them through.
And there's your fringe.
And that's your 2-hour pillow project.
That's it.
And now you said before on these really large needles, you can make things like rugs.
Afghans, rugs, garments. It really depends on what it is you want to do, and it's a great way to use your stash.
Wow, excellent. Thank you so much, Becca.
My pleasure.
We'll be right back.
Knitting Daily. Make time for yarn every day. Projects, patterns, ideas, and techniques from today's show to help you make time for yarn every day can be found on the web at knittingdailytv.com. This is show 104. Continue knitting daily every day by joining the online Knitting Daily community and receive a free newsletter 5 times a week, filled with step-by-step techniques, inspiring reader-contributed stories, and free patterns. It's about knitting all the time. knittingdaily.com. Knitting Daily has been sponsored in part by Interweave Press, inspiring, encouraging, and supporting creative self-expression through the fiber arts. Interweave.com. Fiesta Yarns and Ironstone Yarns. We Are Color. FiestaYarns.com, IronstoneOnline.com. Luette North America, wholesale supplier of yarns, fibers, patterns, spinning wheels, and weaving looms. Luette.com. Yarn Market LLC, a global resource for over 600 yarns plus books, patterns, and other knitting supplies. YarnMarket.com. Webb's, America's Yarn Store, the source for all your knitting and crocheting yarns and supplies. Yarn.com. Taki Stacy Charles, feel the desire, knit your passion. TNNA, the National Needle Arts Association, the organization for independent needle arts retailers. Blue Sky Alpacas, redefining high fiber.